Excellencies, colleagues, friends, welcome to the launch of the UNDP report, Human Mobility, Shared Opportunities, a review of the 2009 Human Development Report and the way ahead. My name is Tolu Olubumi, and I will be your moderator for this event. I am a Nigerian-born, American-raised chemical engineer turned political strategist and social entrepreneur. I am a migrant. I began my career building what is the largest immigrant youth-led movement in US history, and have spent the years since leading social impact campaigns focused on global migration, youth engagement, economic inclusion, and climate change. Protecting the free movement of people is my passion, and I am honored to be a part of today's discussion along with our distinguished speakers. We have worked hard to make this an interactive program and encourage you to use the Q&A function to pose questions to our speakers throughout the event. We will collect your questions and have them answered during the Q&A segment. Now let's get started. It is my pleasure to introduce Asako Okai, UNDP's Assistant Secretary General and Assistant Administrator.
Thank you, Tolu, and distinguished guests, friends, dear ladies and gentlemen. I would like to warmly welcome you all to the launch of the new UNDP report, Human Mobility, Shared Opportunities, a review of the 2009 Human Development Report and the way ahead. There has been no year like 2020. On the 21st of October 2019, 12 months ago exactly, many of us gathered for the launch of another UNDP report on migration, Scaling Fences, a voice of irregular African migrants to Europe, brought the perspective of those undertaking a long and dangerous journey between different parts of the African continent and Europe. A year later, what a different world that we live in. We can no longer gather, but must Zoom. Human mobility has come to an halt, and progress on development has stalled or even regressed. These are unprecedented times. They are also uncertain times. Some things have remained a constant though, despite of COVID-19 or maybe because of it. In the 2009 Human Development Report, Overcoming Barriers to Human Mobility and Development, UNDP showed the value of migration. The evidence presented a picture on how human mobility constitutes a pathway to development. Its authors proposed a series of reforms to advance the gains and reduce the costs. In our new study, Human Mobility, Shared Opportunities, we reviewed the progress, but also the challenges raised by a decade of migration and forced displacement. Jeni Klugman and Kathleen Newland, the two lead authors, will provide a snapshot of human mobility today and plot a way forward in delivering its potential for increased and shared opportunity. We will hear from them that the recommendation made in 2009 are as relevant now as they were then, and probably more. That's because at the heart is global cooperation, inclusion, and solidarity. These values can no longer be only aspirations, but they are essential pillars to recovery and sustainable development. After we heard from co-authors, we will engage in an interactive dialogue on the way forward with top-notch human mobility experts. The dialogue will be moderated in an engaging way by Ms. Tolu Olubumi, whom you just met. And then it is a great pleasure to have with us as panelists, Ms. Marta Forenzi, Director ODI Europe, Mr. William Goss, Regional Coordinator, Migrant Forum Asia, Mr. Gibriel Fal, Professor in Practice, London School of Economics, and Ms. Michelle Layton, Chief Labor Migration Branch, ILO. In this opening segment, I'm delighted that we are joined both by IOM Director General, Mr. António Vitorino, and UNDP Administrator Achim Steiner. The two agencies are already working together within the broader UN family and beyond. But today, we will hear from the top leaders of the organizations how we can make human mobility work for sustainable development through our strengthened partnership. Ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, I'm pleased to introduce UNDP Administrator Achim Steiner. Achim, floor is yours.
Thank you, Asako, and thank you, Tolo. It's a great pleasure to join you today, and in particular to do so alongside my colleague and friend António Vitorino, the Director General of the International Organization for Migration, and this eminent panel to open this dialogue on human mobility, shared opportunities. This study is part of a series of reflections to mark the 30th anniversary of the Human Development Concept, a concept that measures development progress by the expansion of people's freedom, capabilities, and choices. Three notions that I think are very poignant and timely in today's times, rather than just by GDP alone. And today, as human mobility comes to a grinding halt in a way not seen, one could argue since the Second World War, so too has global human development. In fact, human development, according to our Human Development Reports Office, is set to decline in the year 2020 for the first time since the measure began 3 decades ago. These past months have reaffirmed migrants' extraordinary contributions to human development in societies across the world, as health and care professionals on the front lines, as essential workers in their communities. But with scarce jobs, limited access to social safety nets, uneven healthcare, and the threat of xenophobia, stigma, and discrimination, they are also amongst the hardest hit. The great pause triggered by COVID-19 will, we hope, soon be over. But it raises an important question. How will this generational pandemic, alongside growing inequalities and the climate crisis, to mention but 2 additional stress factors, affect human mobility? Will the international community seize the opportunity it presents to build forward better, with human mobility at the heart of human development once again, or will it succumb to the temptation to raise more barriers, curbing avenues for shared opportunities? This is the question at the heart of this new UNDP report, Human Mobility, Shared Opportunities. It echoes the question posed by our 2009 Human Development Report at the height of the global financial crisis a decade ago. Will the economic crisis raise protectionist barriers against immigration, or will it serve as an opportunity to rethink the role of movement in fostering social and economic progress? And it is the question at the center of our discussions today. Much has changed since that 2019 Human Development Report was published, for good and bad. Migration now features clearly in the 2030 Agenda and the Sustainable Development Goals, placing fair and just human mobility at the heart of the future of development. A new architecture for international collaboration on migration was created, namely with the Global Compact on Refugees and the Global Compact for Safe, Orderly, and Regular Migration. And though migration has become an increasingly sensitive, at times polarizing topic, those determined to travel, we know, are not easily deterred. Consider the finding of UNDP's Scaling Fences report of last year, which looked at irregular migration from Africa to Europe through the eyes of those who move. Despite the danger and risks of their fraught journey, only 2% of the people surveyed, and there were thousands, said that greater awareness of the risks would have caused them to stay at home. In fact, 41% of respondents said nothing would have changed the decision to migrate to Europe. That is the level of desperation that drives migration at times. Choicelessness at home was a key reason for their decision. 77% of those interviewed felt that their voice was unheard, or that their country's political system provided no opportunity through which to exert their influence on government. As a result of conflicts and crises, 100 million people were forced to flee their homes in the past 10 years, including Syrians, Venezuelans, and the Rohingya, just to mention 3. While the global refugee population stood at over 26 million by the end of 2019, the highest ever recorded, the overall number of international migrants increased by over 50 million from the year 2010 to 2019. Even though the share of international migrants remains relatively low at 3.5% of the world population, massive movements of populations and sometimes the concentration have come with a rise in xenophobia and anti-migrant sentiments, threatening social cohesion. And yet there is a growing consensus that with the right policies in place, and if people can benefit from better opportunities to migrate by choice and not by necessity or by force, then human mobility can produce triple wins in terms of human development. For migrants and their families, for countries of origin, and for countries of destination. Expanding people's choices is our focus as UNDP. Today, we work globally with the UN Network on Migration in over 40 countries with partners, including the IOM, UNHCR, and ILO teams, to translate the kinds of recommendations set out in this report and to turn them into reality. Supporting refugees from Syria in countries like Lebanon, Jordan, and Turkey with livelihood opportunities. Fostering socioeconomic integration of Venezuelan migrants in Colombia, Ecuador, and Peru. Developing digital platforms to help Rohingya refugees in Bangladesh to earn a living. And working with the diaspora in Moldova to promote local development, while our teams in Afghanistan, Burundi, and Jamaica work with returnees to help them reintegrate into the economies and societies of their countries of origin. At the global level, we have joined our voices with the governments of Switzerland, the UK, and others for action to keep remittances flowing during these difficult times. And building on our work together to mainstream migration into development planning, UNDP and the International Organization of Migration are embarking on a new depth and quality of partnership, focused on making migration work for sustainable development. Antonio, I'm deeply appreciative of the partnership that has made this possible. Ladies and gentlemen, manage properly the movement of people across communities, countries, and continents we know can propel economic well-being, reduce inequalities, and connect diverse societies, a reflection of human freedom and a positive phenomenon in the world. Managed poorly, human mobility delivers political tension and human tragedy. One thing I believe to be true, with much of the world on temporary lockdown, the freedom to move has probably never been more on our minds or on the minds of decision makers around the world than it is today. And so, this discussion on where we go together from here could not be more timely. I would like to end by thanking the lead authors, Kathleen, Newland, and Jeni Klugman, who will table their analysis and recommendations in the course of this discussion, and the many colleagues in UNDP, our sister UN agencies, and well beyond to the many partners and collaborators with whom we have worked and who have contributed to this report. A special thanks to all of you as panelists who have joined us today. I wish you a very fruitful discussion, and I look forward to continued collaboration. Thank you. Asako, back to you, or Tolo.
Thank you, Achim, for your insight. Now it is my great pleasure to introduce Mr. António Vitorino. I am Director General and Coordinator of the UN Network on Migration. Antonio, floor is yours.
Thank you so much, and good afternoon, dear Asako, dear Achim. I appreciate very much your invitation to be here today, joining you in the launch of the review of the very relevant UNDP report of 2009. As you have already mentioned, migration is a global phenomenon shaping the world at every turn, and I do believe touching all of our lives. While in 2019, as Achim has just recalled us, international migrants only made up approximately 3.5% of the world's population. Definitely, I think that in this decade, we have seen migrants providing each time more and more the building blocks for prosperous societies, and they bring knowledge, support, networks, and skills in countries of origin, in countries of transit, and in countries of destination. Yet, as the report says, the development benefits of migration cannot be taken for granted. Positive outcomes are inextricably linked to having, at the same time, conducive social, cultural, political, and economic structures in place to foster the potential of migration in terms of sustainable development. In addition, there are global trends that play a key role in the equation: shifting demographics, persistent inequalities, rapid urbanization, digitalization, of course, and environmental and climate change, not to forget the always permanent question of conflict and violence. All these elements shape the complex interactions between migration and sustainable development. That's why there is no universal rule. Each case is a case, and we need to focus on the characteristics of each situation to understand how can we better foster the contribution of migration towards sustainable development. But I do believe that trying to be a little bit positive on the pandemic, that the COVID-19 has made more apparent the reliance that our societies have on the movement of people. We had never seen such a situation. The entire world has come to a stop. There have been 94,000 restrictions on human mobility in more than 200 countries, territories, and regional areas in the world in these last 7 months. Nevertheless, time and again, migrants are found on the front lines of COVID-19 response, providing essential services, starting precisely with healthcare, but also in agriculture, and being considered essential workers in retail, in delivery, distribution, and even public transportation, therefore powering our economies while the natives were quite often locked down. Yet, paradoxically, the mobility restrictions that I have mentioned have been enforced around the world to control the transmission of COVID-19, which is reasonable and understandable, but at the same time, they have deprived many migrants of their livelihoods, and they have left thousands, hundreds of thousands of stranded migrants in precarious situations, triggering serious concerns for the preservation of their rights, their well-being, and last but not least, their capacity to send remittances back home, on which depend the societies of the countries of origin. In turn, this has created direct knock-on effects across communities and in the wider world economy. Our ability to develop responses that mitigate the negative impacts of COVID-19 to, as Achim said, recover better and get back on track to meet the global sustainable development goals requires urgent and bold action to overcome the remaining barriers to enhance human mobility contributions to sustainable development. Let's be clear, there will be no social economic recovery if we do not relaunch human mobility. But human mobility will have to be relaunched, guaranteeing the safety of all those involved, those who are on the move and the host communities. The past 10 years, since the launch of the UNDP Human Development Report in 2009, have seen, I believe, enormous progress with regards to our global understanding of human mobility and of its intrinsic links with sustainable development. The 2030 Agenda recognizes migration as a core cross-cutting issue to sustainable development. It acknowledges that the promise to leave no one behind will never be fulfilled without due consideration of migration and, of course, the full inclusion of migrants. And very recently, with the COVID-19 pandemic, the question of universal health coverage and guaranteeing the access of migrants to health care has been a very dramatic example how we need to include migrants, not just in the prevention, screening, and treatment of the pandemic, but also include them in the national plans for social economic recovery. The subsequent adoption in 2018 of the Global Compact for Safe, Orderly, and Regular Migration set forth a common vision and paved the way for greater international cooperation and provided us with a roadmap to help achieve the migration dimension of the Sustainable Development Goals. The COVID-19 pandemic on its turn has put the achievement of these Sustainable Development Goals in more peril than ever before. It is therefore now more crucial to keep in mind the 4 key messages of the United Nations Secretary General in his policy brief on people on the move, and at the same time recognizing their validity for all our efforts to achieve the 2030 agenda. Yes, exclusion is costly in the long run, whereas inclusion pays off for everyone. The response to COVID-19 and protecting the human rights of people on the move are not mutually exclusive. And no one is safe until everybody is safe. And this will be crucially important if we get to have a vaccine and if we are able to provide access to the vaccines to everybody, including migrants, refugees, and internally displaced people. And finally, people on the move are part of the solution. UNDP has been a key contributor to strengthening our understanding of human mobility and has worked closely with IOM and other UN agencies to advance the sustainable outcomes. The joint IOM-UNDP leadership in 2 working groups of the United Nations Migration Network underlines precisely this commitment. As IOM and UNDP today look towards a new initiative for strengthened partnership between the 2 agencies, we look forward to continuing this close collaboration and further strengthening our common understanding and support to member states to harness the positive power of human mobility for sustainable development. As IOM Director General and as coordinator of the UN Migration Network, I want to thank you personally, Achim, for your engagement and your constant commitment to this joint endeavor. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Antonio. And then your bold statement about without relaunch of the human mobility, there is no sustainable development, and exclusion is not the choice. Well taken. Director General and Administrator need to go to other engagement now, but before they go, I would like to explain a bit what they mean by UNDP and IOM embarking on a new depth of partnership. Today, all staff of IOM and UNDP have received, just as we open this launch event, a joint message from Director General and Administrator that IOM and UNDP have developed a joint action plan and community of practice to strengthen our cooperation with particular focus on the following 4 areas. First, strategic collaboration on the socio-economic responses to COVID-19. Second, joint outreach and advice to country and regional offices. Third, rolling out joint fundraising and advocacy plans in selected programming areas. And these 4 priorities were determined through a detailed review of our existing partnership, of what was working, what was not, and where there was potential to accelerate positive change by working better together. IOM and UNDP managers at the country and regional level are encouraged to work together to propose concrete joint initiatives. More information on how to do so will be shared through a series of webinars in the coming weeks. We really look forward to the strengthened cooperation between the 2 organizations. With this, I will hand over to Toru for the rest of the proceedings, And thank you, Achim and Antonio, for kicking us off to a new journey and participating in this event. Thank you.
Thank you, Asako. Now, a decade after the publication of the 2009 Human Development Report, amidst rising global inequality, the threat of climate change, and the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic, the themes and policy reforms advanced by UNDP are as relevant as ever. It is my pleasure to welcome the co-authors of the report's review to share their main findings. Dr. Jeni Klugman is Managing Director of the Georgetown Institute for Women, Peace and Security. And Kathleen Newland is Senior Fellow and co-founder of the Migration Policy Institute. Jeni and Kathleen, over to you.
Thank you, Tolu, and welcome to all. I was very happy to take up the offer from the UNDP to revisit the 2009 report, and especially the opportunity to work with Kathleen, who is such an established and well-regarded expert on migration. I had led the 2009 report as the HDR director at the UNDP, but have done various things since then. I think it's worth underlining that the core messages of the 2009 report, which are outlined on the next slide, show that we really broke new ground in making the case for the value of human mobility, both as an enabler of development and a key component of human freedom and capabilities. And the report also proposed a package of reforms to enhance the development gains of human mobility. A decade later, amidst rising global inequality and the threat of climate change, and now the pandemic, the world has changed, of course, in many ways, but the themes remain as central as ever. What we decided to do for this report, working with the UNDP teams and the Human Development Report Office, is to look and see what happened. I do want to note that we submitted the final draft version in December of 2019. So the report itself does not explicitly cover the COVID crisis, although Kathleen will provide some brief reflections today. Looking at the empirical evidence about global patterns of migration, we found significant continuity over time. It remains the case that a large proportion of international migrants, about 3/4, move to countries that rank very high on the Human Development Index. And as we see on the next slide, on average, as has already been mentioned, people who move do achieve substantial gains, not only in terms of income, but also in terms of health, education, and safety outcomes. This is true both for women and for men who move in similar numbers now, although their opportunities and constraints often differ. It's also worth noting that today, as in 2009, it's typically not the poorest who move, since mobility is facilitated by higher income and education levels. So on the one hand, there's significant continuity. At the same time, there have, of course, been some major changes over the past decade. And a series of dramatic events around the world have brought urgency to the forced displacement agenda, with the huge flows of people from Syria, Venezuela, and Myanmar, as well as the northward trek of families from Central America in search of better opportunities and safety. The numbers of refugees and internally displaced people have reached all-time highs of around 70 million, indeed 80 million by June of 2020. And more people are being compelled to move by climate change. On the policy front, the 2009 report presented 6 pillars as an integrated package of reforms to expand the gains of human mobility for sustainable development. And on this, it seems that progress over time has been mixed. There have been some major gains, but also some reversals. So let's just quickly review those. The first pillar was about the expansion of legal pathways, particularly for low-skilled workers. There has been some progress on this, but mostly through regional labour mobility agreements and not writ large. And little progress on visa liberalisation, despite the evident demand for essential workers. Our second pillar was about the protection of rights of migrants and people who move. There has been some progress on this on paper, but the evidence suggests that implementation remains weak, both for refugees as well as other migrants. This means that their access to services and social protection, a point already underlined by the IOM DG, often remains limited, although it is crucial. And migrant women and girls can face particular vulnerabilities here, which are not always being acknowledged and addressed. Our third recommendation related to transaction costs and reducing these, including for documentation as well as money transfers, something which of course was also picked up in the SDG agenda. These costs, the evidence suggests, still remain high and often regressive in impacts. And again, can be particularly constraining for women who lack identification documentation. What we've found in the review of the evidence is indeed that migration can result in triple win situations. On the other hand, the discourse around migration has become increasingly polarized, particularly in host or destination countries. And that's something that Kathleen will speak to as well. On internal mobility, a decade ago, there were still some significant barriers. The good news is that these have had significantly diminished, although of course now with the pandemic, there have been reversals again and of course constraints on this front. And then finally, but not least, we did review the increasing efforts to mainstream migration into development strategies, especially with current countries of origin, who are seeking ways to engage their diasporas and create opportunities for productive uses of remittances. So let me hand over now to Kathleen, who has reviewed how global migration policy frameworks have responded and looks to the ways ahead. Thank you.
Very much, Jenny, and let me also thank UNDP for the opportunity to look back at the groundbreaking 2009 Human Development Report, of which Jenny was the director. It's been a great pleasure working with her on this. A lot of progress has been made in the last decade since the 2000 HDR was published. As you'll recall, the Millennium Development Goals didn't mention migration, but by 2015, migration was recognized in Agenda 2030 and included among the targets of the Sustainable Development Goals. And that was a big breakthrough. It laid the groundwork for the crisis-driven adoption of the two 2018 Global Compacts on refugees and for safe, orderly, and regular migration. Structural innovations in the UN system prepared it better to address migration issues. These included the incorporation of the International Organization for Migration as a related agency of the UN and the creation of the UN Network for Migration to foster synergy among the UN entities that work on migration. Meanwhile, outside of the UN system, the Global Forum on Migration and Development pioneered a more inclusive agenda setting process led by governments, but also involving civil society, local authorities, and the private sector. As you've heard, the 2009 report has lost none of its relevance today, but there are several major issues that have emerged to greater prominence since the original report was written. We highlighted 4. Top of the list is climate change, which has already started to displace many millions of people and will intensify in coming decades. Climate change is recognized as one of the drivers of migration from people who are no longer able to make a living in their usual places of residence. But it's also seen increasingly as a form of adaptation to climate change. The mixed movements of people, states are continuing to confront the needs of vast numbers of people leaving their countries and in desperate need of assistance, protection, and prospects for the future. Some will meet the definition of a refugee and some will not. But regardless of their legal status, they will have similar needs. And these needs are not covered thoroughly in either of the global compacts. And this is an area deeply in need of policy innovation. The future of work is, we are going to see the composition of labor demand continuing to change dramatically with the adoption of new technologies that will profoundly affect international migration. Demand for migrant labor will persist at the high and low ends of the skills spectrum, but often clashing with public perceptions of the very real need for migrants. And finally, a rising inequality we dealt with as a driver of migration, but opinion about the effect of migration on inequality is divided. Some see it as a powerful way to reduce inequality among people in richer and poorer countries. After all, SDG target 10.7 is on safe, orderly, and regular migration is contained within the goal of reducing inequality. Others, however, see migration as a pillar of a liberal international system that concentrates wealth and power in a few developed countries. 2/3 of all highly skilled international migrants go to just 4 highly developed English-speaking countries, as an example of this. So this is a topic that needs further research and reflection. Development partners should first help governments understand the distributive consequences of various policy options and look also at the consequences of inequality for economic growth, for political stability, and social cohesion. I will come back to the new phenomenon of COVID-19 a bit later in my remarks. The migration and development agenda calls for policy innovations and medium and short-term solutions to enhance the development gains of human mobility. Some of the specific recommendations in our report include some that echo the 2009 Human Development Report and some that are new imperatives. The 2009 report talked about opening legal pathways for mobility, including for temporary labor needs. So temporary pathways for temporary labor needs, permanent pathways for those whose work will be needed and who will integrate into their new societies. We need to invest in a better understanding of the dynamics of migration and displacement, first and foremost through better data collection, analysis, and use to support evidence-based policymaking. The role of diasporas in the development of their countries of origin is something that has been on the agenda for some time, but still has very little by way of systematic frameworks. I think we've become more aware than ever that policymakers, opinion leaders need to make a more persuasive case for migration, and that resistance to migration is not going to be broken down just by reference to facts and figures, but there is a need to appeal to people's sense of common humanity, to recognize the legitimate concerns that they have about the changes that migration will bring to their societies, and to address those head on. And we also dwelt on the need to promote economic integration and of migrants and social cohesion in host countries. As you just heard from UNDP Administrator Achim Steiner, The current pause in what we have come to think of as normal migration patterns gives us a chance to reimagine human mobility for more productive outcomes. Some of the things we have learned or have had reinforced are laid out in the Secretary General's policy brief on migration and COVID-19, which IOM Director General António Vitorino just referred to. So I won't dwell on these, just to mention very briefly that migrants must be included in the treatment, in the prevention, and in the restoration of livelihoods associated with the pandemic. As he mentioned, people on the move are part of the solution. The critical economic sectors in country after country depend on the work of migrants at all skill levels. It's important to strengthen social safety nets, not just during the pandemic, but on a lasting basis, so that people are not driven to migrate out of desperation. And we also need to facilitate the flow of remittances back to countries of origin and open up legal pathways for migrants. These are some of the strongest conclusions that we came to in this review of the 2009 Human Development Report. Building coalitions among stakeholders within the framework of the two global compacts is absolutely essential to realizing the gains from international migration. Policy measures like these and those laid out in the Global Compact for Migration can improve the workings of international migration. But one of the insights from research in the past decade is that the most powerful levers to shift migration patterns don't lie in migration policy alone, but in structural determinants such as relative productivity, education and skills, wage and income differentials, social mobility, the existence and the strength of social safety nets, and many other factors. The importance of structural factors in migration dynamics points to the comparative advantage of UNDP and other development institutions in addressing migration. Development agencies have the expertise to address the deep-seated drivers of migration, which are often the same factors that are obstacles to human development: poverty, poor governance, lack of access to education services, inadequate job creation, and so forth. These are largely beyond the reach of migration policy, going much deeper into a country's whole policy environment. So the strategic partnership of IOM and UNDP that we just learned of is exactly what is needed. The last decade of programming to reduce the costs and increase the benefits of migration for developing countries have generally yielded modest results. A new approach is needed, a long-term commitment to improving life in countries of origin from a human development perspective places UNDP and other development institutions in the center of action to make migration a matter of choice, an innately human phenomenon to be accommodated rather than a problem to be minimized. The menu of needed reforms that was laid out in HDR 2009 and which we've reinforced and added to in this paper reviewing that document is going to be difficult to institute those reforms, but it is as important today as it ever was. Migration itself is a dynamic process, and it responds to and shapes a constantly changing world. The COVID-19 pandemic is the latest and most dramatic example of this. First, it's produced the most radical disruption of migration patterns since World War II. The pandemic has created a new kind of migration crisis, a worldwide crisis of immobility as international borders have closed and migrants have been sent home, prevented from taking up opportunities to work in another country, or have had to return home because their jobs have disappeared, leaving them without income at home or abroad. The international system doesn't have many tools for responding to the migration effects of this kind of crisis. The loss of remittance income, livelihoods, foreign exchange inflows. More than 30 countries rely on remittances for 10% or more of their gross domestic product. 4 countries rely on remittances for more than a quarter of their GDP. The pandemic threatens the well-being of migrants, their communities, and their countries of origin, as well as the global economic sectors that depend on migrant labor. Global economic recovery depends on being able to restart migration safely. And this is going to require perhaps unprecedented levels of international cooperation to restore the tremendous benefits of human mobility. And my last point here, that COVID-19 has changed everything and nothing. I've just gone over some of the dramatic changes that it has produced in migration patterns today, and noted that immobility rather than mobility is the current challenge. But the key issues of migration and displacement that were in place before the pandemic started are still with us. Those are the issues that we addressed in this paper, and I very much hope that you will find it useful in keeping an eye on the underlying issues that have been with us before and will remain after the pandemic. Thank you very much. You will see in this slide the link to the report that we have just published, and I hope that you will find the time to download it and look at it and share it with your networks. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jeni. Thank you, Kathleen, for that informative presentation and your work advancing the cause of people on the move. There will be an opportunity to pose questions to Jeni and Kathleen, so please continue to use the Q&A function to submit your questions. Now on to our next segment, which will be a panel discussion. Please join me in welcoming our distinguished panelists. First, we have William Goyce, who is the regional coordinator of the Migrant Forum in Asia, a regional network of migrant organizations, NGOs, advocates, grassroots organizations, and trade unions working to promote the rights and well-being of migrant workers and members of their family. We have Michelle Layton. She is the chief of the Labor Migration Branch for the International Labor Organization, ILO, where she directs the office's work on labor migration and mobility and supports policies and programs related to migrants and refugees. We'll also have Marta Foresti. She is the director of ODI Europe. She also leads the Human Mobility Initiative, managing the Institute's engagement on migration at the global, regional, and local level. Last but not least, we have Professor Jibril Fall. He is a visiting professor in practice at the London School of Economics and co-founder and director of GK Partners, which advises socially responsible businesses and development institutions across the globe. So I would very much love to start with William and talk about, opening the legal pathways and providing and protecting migrants. William, I'm going to start us off here with something that's quite broad and fairly complex question. but what would it take to open up more legal pathways for migrants?
I think, and it is good that the report actually focuses on this, that in the last 10 years, since the first launch of the report in 2009, what has made very little progress is this whole question of legal pathways for migrants. And what it would require is political will from member states to be able to ensure, like the report says, that it's not only high-skilled migrants. Right now, there is a lot of selectivity around high-skilled migrants. But if the human, like the report says, if we do not open for pathways for low wage, low skill sectors, temporary migrant workers, then we will not see a major shift in the development that we say is tied up with migration. So it is important to open up those legal pathways in order to ensure that the development is realized. It means, of course, recognizing our dependency on many of the low skill sector in the temp, and we've seen this now. And I think this is the fantastic thing that has happened, or rather, this is what has happened in this time of the COVID, is that there's been an awakening of our consciousness, and we've called it essential workers. But until then, until before the COVID, these were low skill workers, low wage workers, temporary workers. We had all sorts of categories for them like that. But now we call them essential workers. Recognizing them as essential workers is this awakening of our consciousness, which needs to now translate into political will. Will it translate into political will? That is the question. Look at domestic workers, for example. You just, in the time of COVID, how domestic workers have kept households safe. Yet when you look at the ILO Convention on Domestic Workers, which was adopted in 2011, how many countries today have ratified this convention? We have 30 ratifications. So unless governments don't commit to recognizing that there is a dependency or there is a need for opening up legal pathways for all sorts of migrant workers, irrespective of skills, I don't think we'll see the development indicators that we are hoping for. And this means, like the report says, opening up temporary labor programs. There are many innovative ways in which this can be done in the process, at the same time of upholding rights kind of migrant workers. I find it very strange sometimes the governments speak about legal pathways, yet we seem to speak sometimes in a forked tongue approach kind of thing. And I say forked tongue approach largely because you say legal pathways, but then when you look at the conditions of migrant workers, particularly in the low wage, low skilled sector, you see a lot of abuse and exploitation and a lot of denial of access to justice. So if you talk about legal pathways, then you should also talk about rule of law societies. It should go hand in hand kind of thing. But when you look at migrant workers and access to justice, that whole denial of that, which is evident very even now in the time of the pandemic, for example, with so many layoffs of migrant workers, how many have returned, been repatriated? In our region alone, thousands have been repatriated without getting their wages, their salaries, their end of service benefits kind of thing. And there is no recourse to where they can go to get it. Just putting a cost to that in terms of loss in remittances, that's huge. So if you talk about legal pathways, that discourse cannot be in a vacuum like that without then talking about protections of the rights of migrant workers as well.
Thank you, William. Michelle, as William just shared, and as the evidence shows, migration is usually a triple win situation for migrants themselves, as well as for their origin and host community. But the public discourse has become so polarized, especially in destination countries. From ILO's perspective, what are the key challenges for ensuring migrant workers' integration into the labor markets so as to generate positive socioeconomic benefits?
Well, thank you so much, Toto. Yes, and I mean, I would agree that that migrant workers today face quite significant challenges to integration in societies. And in fact, their chances have worsened during the pandemic. Our assessments have shown rising levels of discrimination against migrants, food insecurity, high unemployment, worsening working conditions, and that includes long hours, exceptionally long hours, the non-payment of wages, and inadequate living conditions, which are actually exacerbating the COVID pandemic spread and risk. And of course, there's increased restrictions on movement and forced returns. We're also seeing that domestic workers, as was mentioned earlier, are really at great risk of experiencing higher rates of violence and harassment and emotional abuse. And much of this stems from the lack of fair and effective governance of labor migration. The crisis itself has exposed the flaws that actually have been there for quite a long time in managing migration. And certainly they project more inequality of treatment, lack of rights protection, and lack of accountability for the exploitation of migrants. This really limits the ability of states to improve building back and certainly building back better, and for economic productivity of businesses. We see all kinds of challenges around the recruitment process and abuses in recruitment and high fees charged to migrants that put them at risk of forced labor and trafficking. We see the fact that there has not been an investment in skills development and skills recognition for migrant workers. And in fact, as Kathleen mentioned, climate change and other areas are going to exacerbate this. And of course, social protection and the lack of social protection has really been significantly recognized as a problem during this COVID pandemic. Migrant workers are simply not protected. And some of the ways that we see are needed to build back for countries to really take a look at their labor migration frameworks and policy coherence. That is, coherence between migration policies on the one hand, those policies dealing with the labor market and employment on the other hand, and certainly education and training. The investment in skills, for example. It's not just about skills development and recognition when migrant workers are in countries of destination, but we're seeing the need for capacity building of institutions in origin countries because hundreds of thousands of migrant workers have already returned to their home countries and their skills and their talents are not recognized. So this will really prevent or hamper their ability for upward mobility, but also for businesses to build back and to use those skills that they need. So concentrating on these areas are really important, including really helping these countries expand and extend social protection to migrant workers. And this needs improvement everywhere. So we put out guidance on all of these areas and we're working with countries to help them look at how they can improve their labor migration governance systems.
Thank you, Michelle. Now, Martha, if I could turn to you, Michelle brought up something very important in terms of like skills building and making sure that folks are protected in their home countries as well as the countries of destination. Now, can you talk a little bit about how we go from theory to practice in making the most of the opportunities that human mobility can bring to development? Obviously, this is so much of the work that you're doing at ODI. Can you talk a little bit to that for us, please?
Sure, thank you, Tolu, and thanks everyone. I've got 3 ideas about how we make progress in practice, but before I share my ideas with you, allow me a reflection very much comes from within development, or the development sectors are coming from those of us who've been working as practitioners or policymakers in development. In 2009, migration, mobility, was not a major issue in the development conversations. The report was groundbreaking for that very reason. And I think I remember at the time, I remember many human development reports. And I think it's fair to say there was a very small group of us, even I, today I do a lot of work on migration, was certainly not focusing much of my daily job on issues related to human mobility. And I mean in development here in a very broad sense, not just in sort of development agencies or aid agencies or NGOs, but more broadly in all the communities trying to create economic and social opportunities for everyone in different parts of the world. Fast forward to 2020, migration now is on the agenda of development. It is part of the conversation about global development. And in fact, whenever at ODI and elsewhere, ODI is a think tank that works a lot on international development, we say that we want to become more of a global think tank that works on global issues. Migration and climate change always come up as the two critical sort of global issues that as a community we really want to contribute to make a difference to. So that's major. It means that today we have an opportunity to change practice in ways that I don't think we were anywhere near having in 2009. And I think that as many, all the speakers have highlighted, so much has changed, and we now have a policy framework and a set of very important tools, as well as some, hard lessons to be learned from COVID-19 and others about how to do things differently. And so let me just try three, concrete ideas about what we need to do, because the reality is that I think we do need to do things a little bit differently than we've done it thus far to make the most of this opportunity and this space that has been created. The first, we need once and for all to clarify what we mean by development in this context. I mean, there is such a risk that when we talk about human mobility and development or migration and development, the assumption is being made that we're talking fundamentally about aid relations, and we're talking about the realities of low-income countries as countries of origin, and then rich countries or high-income countries as countries of destination. Development here is actually about our collective future, and actually COVID-19, I think, has confronted us all with how interlinked that is. And migration, by definition, is a policy area that the links the destinies of countries and populations from all over the world. But it's important to make that difference, because there is such confusion around the idea that what we're talking about here fundamentally is for rich countries to provide development aid to poor countries in ways that will support local development in ways that in turn will reduce migration, onwards migration. So we really need to, to break down that narrative. And the interesting perspective on that is that not long before 2009, I was actually working in Italy at the Ministry of Finance in the then, development policy department, which was not dealing with African countries or low-income countries. It was dealing with Italian regions in southern Italy that were lagging behind. That was the language compared to the north. And so that was the whole context of local economic development. And migration was not on the agenda there. And if you think about that, these regions have been at the forefront of the receiving end of so much so-called irregular migration in the last few months, in the last few years. So really important to move on from that perspective. Two, we need to do things differently. And this means we need to think about the entry point for change in practice. Kathleen said earlier that migration policies are not the only policies that can affect migration outcomes, and there are a number of structural factors. Similarly, if we're in the business here of achieving development outcomes, we need to think about not thinking of migration policy alone as what we're trying to improve or change, but think about how migration and the reality of immobility can contribute or hinder development outcomes in different sectors. So it means really moving the conversation down or towards a much more sectoral dimension to do some of the things that António Vitorino mentioned earlier, which is to begin to think about adapting the reality of the relationship between migration and development to the specific, to the specific context where it happens. Since the work that I followed with others on the Global Compact for Migration, in the last couple of years, I mostly worked from within development sectors, climate, education, urban, economic development these days, working with mayors and cities, and to really engage at this sectoral level to what does it mean to bring the reality of mobility inside development practice. And later on, I'll hope to give you an example in relation to climate change. What that working differently means requires actually communities of practice to begin to understand each other a little bit more. I'm actually quite surprised, given how much groundwork has been done, that there is still such little habit for practitioners from across the migration world to, say, climate, to labor, to labor policies, to really find practical ways to understand each other and devise together programs and ideas. I mean, the obvious risk that we see in a number of development agencies and institutions right now is to come up with a separate set of programs labeled as migration programs, rather than really integrating the reality of mobility inside development practice. That requires quite a lot of work. And thirdly and lastly, we've got to look ahead. We talked about innovation. There is a bit of a temptation, and again, climate is a good example, where when it comes to migration, we tend to emphasize only, or to overemphasize, the challenges or all the, everything that happens that prevents things from being right or from working well. And yet we need to think about setting them up differently to make the most of that opportunity. I think one of the key lessons to me on the COVID experience has been how much of what we've seen happening around the world to facilitate the participation of migrant workers to the COVID response has entailed removing blockages, obstacles the migration policy would have introduced to, say, to the recognition of skills and qualifications, to the number of hours that nurses had to work. And so to really now think ahead to avoid making the same mistakes again, that in a way that migration policy comes in the way to achieving particular outcomes for everyone, and really think ahead about how innovative practices, different modalities, different forms. I think Kathleen mentions part of the recommendation, temporary working visa and arrangements. So things that can be done practically and differently, looking ahead to try to avoid some of the problems that we have, we now know have been created by not understanding in what ways the reality, the fact that people move and the reality of populations movement affects development outcomes. And I hope to give you some more practical examples in a minute on how to do that.
Thank you so much. As you spoke, what I kept hearing and thinking was innovation, innovation, innovation. The recommendations from the 2020 UN Secretary General's policy brief on COVID-19 and people on the move includes using the digital revolution to achieve transformative development outcomes. Jibril, if I could go to you now, what do you consider to be the key challenges regarding the use of digital innovation in the field of human mobility?
Thank you, Tolu. I would say for me, the three big challenges are around privacy and regulatory compliance, number one. Number two, transparency and technological bias. And number three, what I call fact checking and fake checking. So if we come back to privacy and regulatory compliance, we are not yet at a situation whereby there is a global or generally agreed set of omissions and commissions that are the things that must not be done in the field of digital technology relating to human mobility. And examples of the things that should not be done are like collecting data for the purposes of spying, for the purposes of subterfuge, for the purposes of undue control of migrants, and the use of private data by different public institutions. That, for example, should be an omission, but there's no global agreement whereby that framework is established. Another example is not necessarily what the public institutions do, but what happens in the world of technology. That is this trolling and other forms of misbehavior, as it were, that can adversely affect migrants and people on the move. And there are the positive or commitment things that also needs to be in such a framework. That is to make a purposeful decision that the technology would be used to empower and to enhance the processes of migration and mobility. And that would mean having some sort of universal operability whereby whatever document you have and the intelligence chips in the documents or whatever device you use can easily be used across borders, across jurisdiction. On the second main challenge of transparency and technological bias is that this is reality, that technology and the digital possibilities and innovations, they are not neutral devices. They, in fact, tend to have hidden and embedded tendencies. And these tendencies can actually be very negative to disadvantaged people, and in many cases, migrants are disadvantaged in that they are seen as outsiders. And this happens through original error, or in sometimes it's even original design in the coding or through the routine element of machine learning. So with that challenge, there needs to be a framework for not only regular machine checking, but for human intervention and for user input and multi-stakeholder input in reviewing and not trusting the intelligence of what I call algorithmic bias. The third element is we're all familiar with the need for fact-checking, but the very versatility of digital platforms and digital technology means that even though we're struggling with getting to grips with fact-checking, we are virtually not started with the getting to grips with fake-checking. In fact, the technology to create fake, be it ordinary or deep, is more advanced than the technology to notice, check, and indeed pull down fakes. So that means that, and that's a whole range from malware and the cloning of official websites, and you have technology and online technology and database technology is also quite appealing to a particular type of person. That is the chancer and the fraudster. And this is like good home for them. So that being the case, that means we not only have to be alert, we have to have very many devices in order to deal with this new problem and this new challenge. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jibril. It's the digital divide is just continuing to widen, you know, with the COVID-19 pandemic. Michelle, that makes me want to come to you on how countries can address the challenges of socioeconomic integration and development for a future that really promotes decent work. What are ILO's recommendations to countries as we seek this future of more decent work for migrants and refugees?
Well, thanks so much, Tolu. I really have enjoyed following this debate. I mean, it opens up so many different avenues of possibilities for change. And I mean, I think the biggest change will be for countries to really examine their migration policies, because so much has not lived up to what they believed it promised, at least for migrant workers, for business and others. And the COVID pandemic has really exposed those flaws. We need modern policies, ones that really look to protecting rights of migrant workers, understanding how much they contribute to societies. I think it was Achim who said in the beginning that they're essential. We know that. And yet our laws have really not been able to address the systemic abuses and exploitation in so many ways. And yet we know they contribute to development. So we have established guidance now and tools to help countries develop fair and effective labor migration frameworks to work in cooperation across borders. And that means looking at how to ensure there are regular pathways for migration, but those which also recognize the protection of rights, the ability of migrant workers' skills to be recognized and to have them recognized fully so that they can really participate and contribute to labor markets in the destination country, but of course, when they return. There's guidance on how, as many migrant workers are returning home now, they can better integrate into the labor market. And this will mean looking at our institutions like public employment services, looking at how we help migrant workers benefit from the skills they've gained abroad, contribute to business at home, maybe become entrepreneurs. Many become entrepreneurs of small businesses, but to help them ensure that they can improve their integration in their home labor markets. And that really is about promoting decent work. And I saw one of the chat box comments was, how can you ensure there isn't competition between national jobs and jobs of migrant workers returning home or migrant workers in other countries? I think that is really a key aspect of what decent work is all about. It's about ensuring that nationals have, and all nationals, including migrant workers and those in the labor market, have access to equality of treatment, to the kinds of opportunities that their skills can be matched to, that you involve a dialogue about policies with those on the front lines. And those are the employers' organizations in business, the trade unions, and workers' organizations who see and work in the labor market. Bringing them into the dialogue with ministries of labor is really going to improve the ability of success for labor markets to grow and function as they emerge from the COVID crisis, and certainly in destination countries to ensure that these policies are fair and that they benefit all of those who are engaged. Now, we're going to be releasing very soon a report on wage discrepancies, and I can tell you that these findings are quite shocking in terms of what nationals and migrant workers make. And if you're able to pay migrant workers 40% below what national wages are, then that undercuts the labor market. It undercuts competitive business, but it also means that national workers' jobs are undercut. So these are areas in which policy and guidance has been developed, in which we're going to be working very closely with governments to help them reorient their policies to become much more modern, much more responsive to the needs emerging from the COVID crisis. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Michelle. William, in one of our conversations before this event, you said, change is upon us. Let us dare to make it a transformation towards justice and peace. You say this while we're living in a world where countries have closed their borders during the pandemic. What are the main lessons learned in terms of legal pathways that can transform the path of migrants and refugees towards justice and peace?
Look, I think during the pandemic, quite a number of countries of destination also took measures to ensure that migrants' rights were respected. For example, access to health services. There were a number of countries of destination that actually gave migrant workers that, even undocumented migrant workers. So for the first time, there was the realization of the pandemic or how it could affect the community, the local community, meant that the virus could affect all. The virus doesn't discriminate. And so there were governments that recognized this and recognized that even workers in an irregular situation or an undocumented situation need to have that access. Otherwise, the whole of society is at risk. Now, that enlightenment in that moment meant the recognition of services to workers irrespective of status. This is something we have been advocating for even before the pandemic. So why can't we now realize that? Regularization. This is another measure that was taken by a number of governments when they saw that, okay, there is going to be a fall in the labor market as workers were going home, like in countries like Lebanon and things like that. There was a recognition, okay, why don't we do a regularization of workers in an undocumented situation? This was a measure that was taken. Now, we've always constantly called for measures like this. Access to justice. Some governments set up special online platforms for workers to make complaints. The UAE, for example, even did a mobile court kind of going into labor camps and hearing cases and making decisions at the moment. Qatar, for example, introduced a minimum wage in the time of COVID. So there are countries that have taken measures. There are countries that even extended work permits, resident visas and things like that up to the end of the year if they were expiring, so that workers don't have to fall into an undocumented or irregular status. So a lot of this has happened in the time of COVID. And if we start looking at it, we can see that a lot of these were being called for before the pandemic. But states refused to give this. But in a situation of crisis, there was an enlightenment kind of thing. And yes, we need to do this. And states took those measures. So why don't we extend those measures beyond COVID? Why don't we take this as learnings in the time of COVID and extend them beyond kind of thing? Because like the report says, and I like what Kathleen was saying as well, the whole question of inequalities. When you take fall of remittances that countries are going to have experienced in this period. When you look at the structural inequalities that were there between and among countries, when you look at the increased debt that countries have taken on, external debt, developing countries have taken on in order to address the pandemic kind of situation. When you look at all that, you can expect that countries of origin will be looking for, or there will be a move for deployment overseas for work. You will see an increase of workers in the low wage sector, in the low skills sector, wanting to go overseas. That this is going to happen, and we will have to be able to see how we make that right, for or how we ensure that this realization of them being essential workers and holding up our economies, keeping us safe and things like that, how this translates now into policy, how this translates now into practice kind of thing is going to be key to how we come out of this pandemic in terms of learning from it and instituting practice that ensures the fundamental rights of migrant workers and people on the move.
Thank you so much for that, William. Martha, I want to come back to you and talk a little bit about the interlinkages between human mobility and climate change. You know, climate change is a key challenge our world is facing. How can policymakers do better on human mobility and promote a low carbon transition?
Thank you, Tolu. I thought I'd share these ideas around climate because they're, I think, to me, a very good example of what I mentioned earlier about trying to do things differently and to think at the landscape of migration and development differently. So when it comes to climate, I think if I say to you climate and migration, most of you will be aware of the fact that there is a very lively debate, a very pressing debate, urgent debate about the fact that it is very likely, in fact, pretty inevitable that a number of people will be displaced as a result of climate change, and therefore climate change referred to as a driver and a root causes of migration. And within that, ideas about what can be done to mitigate that, as well as a lot of discussions and debates about a way to estimate those the numbers that are likely to of people that are likely to be displaced as a result of climate. And one thing that I thought when in relation to this, having worked a little bit on migration and development the last few years, was a bit of a worry that here we go again, sort of fueling a bit a narrative of crisis, of the inevitable and certainly involuntary movement, a lot of people that will actually, create anxiety and fuel some of the anxieties and some of the tensions that we've witnessed on issues related to climate and migration. And the problem with that is not that obviously one should underestimate the potentially negative effects that climate will have on migration and the fact that people will be displaced, but also to make sure that that doesn't prevent us from thinking about all other aspects of that relationship and actually what can be done, particularly in terms of development policies and investment. So the second way to think about it is something that, again, Kathleen has mentioned earlier, which is increasingly migration is being considered as a potentially very useful and effective adaptation strategy. And so the idea that people can be encouraged to move and incentives could be put in place so that people can move before climate events happen in ways that can affect livelihoods. And again, trying to be a bit more, to think a bit more innovatively and experimentally, and a number of countries are doing on how that adaptation strategy can be activated. The third area that we at ODI have been beginning to do some work on, and it was very much from colleagues of mine that work on the low carbon transition and the kind of economic transformation that we required to activate the potential of carbon transmission. And there the idea is that, of course, like many other examples of economic transformation, the fact that people move, that workers move as part of that transition is something to take into account, to build in the strategy and investment for that kind of economic transition. Let me share with you a couple of infographics just to illustrate the point. So we know that the reality of low carbon transition has the potential to actually create jobs, and it will create job opportunities around the world. These are some of the estimates, about 18 million jobs worldwide that could be filled. The other thing that we know about the low carbon transition is that there will definitely be skill shortages that will be generated, and that all sorts of actors will find it hard to fill those vacancies. And again, to think ahead of the fact that perhaps those vacancies and those skills can be filled, through reskilling of existing workers, but also actively thinking about how labor mobility can help can help fill some of those gaps. If you think about how much experimentation there is going on at the moment on international skills partnerships and the idea of trying to create opportunity for skills development between countries, between regions, or between, in fact, cities, something we're working on. And a number of those could be specifically directed at supporting the low carbon transition. I don't have the time to go into any details now, but basically we actually really highlighted in this work how much there is a need for the communities that are currently not working together in relation to low carbon transitions to do so, and to think about ways in which that transition can be supported, and how migration can help that particular kind of transition. And that anticipating labour and skills needs, reskilling existing and new workers, and facilitating labour mobility as a strategy that can be part of the reskilling and the job creation and the job transitions is something that could be thought of in advance, rather than perhaps be considered as a second thought. To be clear, here we're not talking just about international migrants. Think about all the workers that move from one certain industry that scale down as a result of low carbon transition. I'm thinking about, for example, what happened on mining in the UK, that will generate some forms of labour mobility of workers that will need to move from one location to another. Some of it would be internal, some will be international. But again, as such, investment, both in terms of financial resources and political landscaping and policy thinking about how to support this now really urgent transitions that really need to happen rapidly, and how much the economies need to adapt, and how much of an opportunity actually COVID has produced to accelerate that transition, to really at that stage, is another version of making the positive case for migration that Kathleen mentioned earlier. Is almost making the instrumental and strategic case that the movement of labour mobility can be part of the toolbox that we have at our disposal to support that transition, or to mitigate the risk of that not being managed in a way that will produce negative effects, including on reduced workers' rights and increased inequality. There is a lot more to be said about, we have a set of very specific recommendations for the 3 different sectors, the 3 different policy areas. But again, practically, as we head towards COP26, and generally as the conversations around climate and the urgency of the low carbon transitions accelerate in the next few months, what can we do collectively to bring the reality of mobility to the heart of that conversation, and to make sure that we do not limit our engagement with the climate debate to ways in which we can estimate the inevitable consequence of climate being the displacement of people, but thinking about the opportunities that migrant workers bring to accelerating that economic transition, in the way, thinking about how much we've learned about the role of migrant workers in the COVID response as an example of the potential role. So it's just a thought about taking a policy area and really think about it from different perspectives, and making sure that we do not repeat the mistakes of limiting the migration perspective to one that then just require fixing afterwards, rather than thinking ahead about how to maximize and make the most of. And I'll be happy to share the link to the report and to some of the recommendations to everyone who's interested.
Thank you so much for that. Jibril, if I could turn to you quickly and ask, what would you consider to be the priority themes for multilateral action to harness technological innovation for human mobility? Jibril, do we have you?
Yes. Can you hear me now?
Yes, sir.
If I have to choose one, it would have to be to do with SDG target 10.7C. Some of my colleagues on this call will remember that I opposed that target, because that target says the cost of remittances should go down to 3% by 2030. I opposed it because I thought it lacked ambition, because even in 2015, the technology existed for one to be able to send money, $300 in 3 minutes for 3%. In fact, in one session at the UN, I did that the night before to be able to confirm that I can achieve that. Now, the technology existing, and yet today, we still have pockets and corridors of remittances in double digits, which takes away billions if not hundreds of billions of migrants and diaspora money away from households, small businesses, and socioeconomic development. But for this major change to happen, governments need to come for major intervention. In the 1960s, the commonest way of transferring money was the briefcase or the postal order. In fact, it's one of the classic novels on migration by the Senegalese writer Sembène Ousmane was called Le Mandat, and it was published in 1966, the money order. But by the end of the 1960s, the banks wanted to be involved in this business of moving from just only business money international transfer to personal international money transfer. What did they do? They did something that changed the financial architecture in the world. They formed in 1973 the Society for Worldwide Interbank Financial Telecommunication. You're wondering, I've never heard of that before. You have. That is SWIFT. It's a cooperative. It's SWIFT payments. And it changed the architecture, created innovation to the extent that now there are so many other platforms and digital technology platforms that are even better than SWIFT, reducing the cost and the time and the transparency of transfers. So we need that degree of what I call universal interoperability in relation to money transfer for migrants and diaspora.
Wow, thank you so much for that. This is has been an excellent discussion, and we could keep going, but I really just have to pull in Jeni and Kathleen. If you could join us for this, there's a burning question within me, based on the recommendations in your report. If you could make only one reform to the global human mobility system, which would you choose? I know that is incredibly complex and perhaps a little unfair, but I have to pose that question to you.
Well, I will plunge in if I may, Tolu, and thanks to all the panelists for their very stimulating remarks. If I had to choose one thing, I believe it would be wider and more efficient legal pathways for low-skilled migrants and for temporary migrants, because they are the people who can benefit most from the opportunity to move internationally, even if it's only for a limited amount of time. You know, they will typically earn as much as in an hour as international migrants as they would earn in a day at home. So I think that, and their labor is needed. It's very clear, as William said, it's not only the high-skilled labor that is needed, but the labor of those people who are very often women, who provide personal services, who provide the high-touch services of childcare, elder care, you know, even some of our small luxuries like beauty salon services and so on. So I think that it is important that those pathways be designed and expanded in a way that can meet the demand and the need for the services of migrants who are often described as lower skilled. They often have very high levels of skill, but they're not skills that have formal accreditation or that are recognized to when the French government tried to attract domestic workers to harvest asparagus, for example. They found that these new unskilled workers ruined as much as half of the crop because they didn't have the skills of a highly specialized agricultural worker who's defined as low skilled in our usual way of speaking. So that would be, I think, if I could only do one thing, I think that's what I would do.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Jeni, if I could throw that same question to you, please.
Well, I was going to actually say the same. I mean, I guess it was the first on our list, but I very much concur. But I guess just in reflecting, it is also very much linked to our, you know, what was then the second pillar around around rights, you know. So I think by recognizing kind of legal pathways, that in a sense is a pathway as well to ensuring, you know, that rights are observed and enforced and enforceable by people who move, including people who move, you know, without resources and without, you know, aren't moving, you know, upon university graduation, but are moving with kind of very important skills, as Kathleen outlined. So I think that that remains something, you know, at the forefront of the agenda on which, you know, progress remains to be made. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And thank you to all of our speakers. This has been just an incredible discussion, and I quite frankly could keep going. I know we're over our time, but this has been fascinating, informative, engaging, and I'm so grateful to all of you. Thank you so much. It has been a pleasure being your moderator. I would love now to welcome back Asako to give us our closing remarks. Thank you all so much.
Thank you, Toru, and then thank you, participants in the audience as well. Like Toru, I'm so fascinated. I want to continue on discussing on this and in such an engaging way. Thank you for all the contributions. The UNDP had been they are working in this arena, but they are just hearing from all of you. Made me think that, oh, there's so much scope that we need to incorporate. For instance, we've been working in the strengthening of capacity of national actors and local public authorities, but we need to think of not only the market inclusion, but the protection side, legal pathways. How can we incorporate them in the decent work, a future of work to adapt to climate change or the digital, all that is part of the equation. Mitigating the adverse drivers of migration and forced displacement, that's the kind of the prevention work that we do, but this has to be hand in hand with the actions to enhance the contribution of the migrants in the society, where it is from the origin country or the transit or destination, and then there are so much to do. So I would just conclude by saying that I hope this event is not the end of the process. It's a rather beginning of a new one with the enhanced collaboration. We appreciate all the contribution. We would definitely try to convene this sort of the gathering to deep dive on some of the things that has been teased out by all of you. Thank you very much. I just I'm very conscious of the time. I really regret that I have to stop, but thank you so much for all the participants. Great. So I have to say goodbye, but we'll get you engaged. Thank you very much.